Boa tarde, então, novamente. Vamos dar início a mais uma sessão do nosso Seminário de História Religiosa, que dedicamos este ano ao tema largo, o catolicismo português em diáspora, agentes, instituições e sensibilidades religiosas. Para o tema de hoje, temos connosco a professora Sabina Pavone, que vai tratar connosco da temática dos relatos de conversão no espaço português da Ásia, modelos e representações, como certamente viram no resumo da apresentação, centrar-se-á certamente mais sobre o sul da Índia, geografia a que nós ainda não tínhamos também dado espaço no nosso seminário. Temos a apresentação da professora Sabina Pavone na ficha do seminário. É professora titular de História Moderna da Università di Macerata, em Itália. A sua área de investigação encontra-se na interseção entre a história religiosa e a história cultural. Escreveu vários livros sobre os jesuítas na Rússia, o antijesuitismo, as conversões e as missões jesuítas na Índia. No breve resumo temos precisamente a referência a essas obras. Sobre a temática da conversão na Ásia Portuguesa, escreveu também vários artigos e livros, que também aí estão apontados. Talvez pudesse recordar um que ainda está no prelo, Mi faccio romano, racconti di conversione nella prima età moderna, que tem coedição com outros dois historiadores italianos. Eu agradeço à professora Sabina Pavone os ter disponibilizado para estar connosco nesta tarde, para esta sessão do nosso seminário. A sessão será em inglês. Depois, o diálogo, se for necessário, temos connosco o Dr. Francesco Renzi, que poderá também ajudar a fazer alguma tradução, quer as perguntas sejam colocadas no chat, quer sejam colocadas oralmente. Professoressa, la ringrazio di essere con noi questa sera. A lei la parola.
Grazie mille, obrigada. Thank you very much for your invitation. And today I will speak about tales of conversion in Asian Portuguese space, models and representation. I share with you my PowerPoint, and will have different quotations, but I wrote in my PowerPoint, so I hope you will follow them easily. We begin with a map of India. Because I will speak about conversion in India, in Portuguese India, and in the south of India during the 16th and 17th century. Unfortunately, I will speak in English, but I try to speak slow. Conversion narratives are documents that certainly stimulate the reader's curiosity, but they run the risk of remaining enmeshed in the worldview of the writers, whose intention, more often than not, is to emphasize their evangelizing successes in distant lands. This is especially evident in the propaganda strategies deployed by the Society of Jesus, the leading missionary order to establish a presence in the south of India between the 16th and the 18th centuries, which broadcast mainly through its lettres édifiantes et curieuses, an image of soft conversion linked to the principle of accommodation. In more general terms, the conversion accounts written for publication were aimed at a European market, and the strands of colonization and evangelization tended to get pretty intermixed. And once again, this ended up being documents whose promotional aims were manifest. Nonetheless, not all missionary reports were of the same tenor, and it is possible to dig out, especially from manuscript sources, elements that render these narratives a good deal more problematic and which, most importantly, can function as a useful litmus paper for registering the dynamics operating in the missionary world. The theme which lends itself especially to such investigative readings is that of the role of violence in conversion, as regarded in missionaries' reports home. This is a field of inquiry most obviously apted to a New World context, given Evangelist Obvious Conquest association in that area, but which is more nuanced in its Asian manifestation, which appear at first sight to belong more to the sphere of soft conversion mentioned above. The profusion of Jesuit documentation and the accessibility to the Society's archives has led scholars to privilege that source, which most often, however, reveals only one side of the coin, that obviously most favorable to the order and to the Catholic Church, where violence is generally endured rather than practiced. Here, the theme of martyrdom is only the tip of the iceberg in a panorama of Christians and converts as victims. Nonetheless, documentary evidence there is, even if, like its propagandizing counterpart, it tends also to be conditioned by ulterior motives, in this case having to do with the infighting between the religious orders which typified the greater part of missionary endeavor in the East during the modern era. Augustinian, Capucins, Jesuits, Discalced Carmelites, Dominicans, variety of clerics directly dependent on the propaganda fide congregation, none are exempt from the squabbling and conflict often within the same order. All the protagonists at one time or another of clashes that attract the attention of alert commentators. Look at from this angle, the theme of conversion can conveniently be framed in a complex dynamic that not only involves a multitude of actors, political and religious, in the field, but also help us to revise a chronology too often taken for granted by studies on the subject. There is, in fact, a tendency to see a sort of evolution in conversion practices from a 16th century typified by a razing of temples and the use of violence, accompanied by an excessive reliance on mass baptism, to a 17th century where an awareness of encountering an important civilization, such as that of India, had led to a greater deployment of conciliation relative to the past, while the available sources actually testify to a much more nuanced situation, which I now want to look at. Now I will pass to the first text I will examine today. That is a long letter written on 10 April 1663 by the cleric regular Antonio Lubelli. And this letter was sent to the Papal Nuncio in Naples. In these letters, that is called a true account of certain important matters in the Christian state of the East Indies, a damning indictment not only of the secular Portuguese operating in that part of the world, but of the missionary too, is done in this letter. I begin with the first quotation. Your Lordship will be aware how I have found that here that a number of English and Dutch heretics have been making sport to the prejudice of the Catholic Church concerning the numerous conversions of wool peoples and kings and emperors and queens and princesses and such like things that have been noised abroad in a series of publications and reports, which they well know, being informed about the places where these triumphs are supposed to be occurred to be false and fantastical, as indeed is the case, because apart from the Christianity of the Fishery Coast and the Serra of Malabar, one of which is on the brink of being lost and the other already gone, all the other tales of conversions, along with martyrdom and ambassadors appearing before the Holy See sent by kings and princes newly won over, are without any foundation whatsoever. So in this letter by Lubelli, he begins to say that everything is false. He began by repudiating all the false and imaginary contents of the propagandistic booklets that habitually describe the Indian mission as a great success story, going so far as to hope that, another quote, Supreme Pontiff prohibit all the books dealing with such matters. The missionary did not stop there, however, and denounced the treatment afforded to neophytes, both by secular Portuguese and much more reprehensibly by the clergy as well. Your Excellency should know how ill treatment by those of the Holy Faith are the reason that those who convert are sorely afflicted and most unhappy, and that others are therefore more reluctant to acquiesce and receive the faith, arguing against those who would convert them when they have seen others make the error of becoming Christians, that no one will hold them in any consideration, that they will lose everything gained and be despised by all. To apprise your lordship of all and everything that has occurred in this regard would be impossible, but for the sake of information, I will give your lordship an example. Let him imagine that some Gentile is made much of, treated with great courtesy and ceremony, invited to be seated and so on, welcomed with familiarity into one's house, made a party to one's business, and then I say, suppose that on becoming a Christian, he is suddenly treated rudely, excluded from business affairs, not asked to sit, nor welcome into one's home without honor and familiarity, but if at all, with rudeness and in terms hardly different from those one who used to a slave, as if the baptism were but a prelude to thraldom. And he continues, I don't read all this quotation. On the more interesting section concerned the condition of slaves under Portuguese ownership, their treatment not apparently being criticized by the missionary, who instead connived with the system. And I quote, it's the last long quote of Lubelli report. Your Excellency will be aware of the cruelties perpetrated on the slaves, both the men and the women, which I will say something about, and concerning the unjust imprisonment which is visited of some of them, without any reason, be giving locked. Sorry, because I don't see. Just a moment. Okay. Being given to justify their confinement, just as those who are kidnapped and sold in other ways unjustified sequestered. Any falling short in their service is routinely punished by depriving them of food, and often by being locked up on that, with shackles and the cruelest of beatings, all of which hit their target, none missing, and administered with the unfortunates tied to a ladder or a bed in such a way as they cannot move for all their efforts. And more than once it has happened that they perish under such wicked chastisement. So numerous protests against the Catholic Church have taken place due to the ill treatments meted out by the missionaries themselves against these Christians, treating them as slaves, raining beatings and buffeting on them, making them bow down before them as Greek lords, pretending to be addressed as high and mighty, making them leave their shoes in the street and come barefoot to audience and treating them with great contempt. Furthermore, in the CEHR, the missionary generally would not even approach undesirables, nor allow them to come into the churches, nor baptize their children. I do not know why nothing is done to remedy this, and particularly in those places where the Portuguese are in charge and hold in the reins of both temporal and spiritual authority. So this was many quotation of this letter of Lubelli, because I think it's a very important letter to understand what is the climate in this period in the missionary territories in Portuguese India. According to Lubelli, the patronage should be removed from these clerics and the poor soul to be put with other families who would deal lovingly and charitably with these Christians. But in relation to these matters, he asked that his letter be kept as secret as possible otherwise, because, he said, myself and all my order will make ourselves odious and will be in danger of being chased out of the Indies. Lubelli's criticism of the religious orders operating in those territories, and the Jesuits first among them, although not explicitly named, was certainly deployed with a view to promoting another form of mission, such as proposed by the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the Congregation Propaganda Fide, but it is not to deny that he was reflecting a genuinely abusive situation. His extended indictment included all the players that operating in southeastern India. Rivalry between missionaries belonging to different religious orders was compounded at the age of the 17th century by the Lusitanian Church losing ground, and the knock-on effect of such difficulties could not but have a bearing on the position of the neophytes and the significance of their conversion in a situation characterized by both by caste division within Indian society and a strong Muslim presence. In this sense, the theme of violence is intrinsically tied to how the Indian neophytes saw themselves in a Catholic colonial ambience that was in some difficulty in the face of traditional caste divisions, and above all in relation to the concept of honor as it was applied within the Brahmin caste. It should be remembered that according to the caste system, conversion to Christianity immediately downgraded the social status of the convert. As Sanjay Subramanian has written, the religious problem regarding conversions needs to be considered in two distinct, I quote, in two distinct contexts, one where conversion is at issue and one where it is absent. The first of these dominated missionary thought in India and China in the later 16th century. In order for a Gentile to convert to Christianity, what could he retain? What could he, and what did he need to abandon? The marketing what had to be abandoned became the key to Gentile religion. It should also be borne in mind that the Estado de India in the 17th century had not only to cohabit with a series of Muslim sultanates, but to deal with the other colonial powers, first of all the Dutch, but also the English and the French. Missionary strategy was strongly conditioned by the geopolitical context had from time to time to square up to and negotiate with these other players. A number of studies in recent years have shown how the bickering between the religious order not only affected the internal equilibrium of the missionary world, but also involved the sometimes opportunistic interest of the Muslim principalities in a dialogue where it can be difficult to interpret the motives of the various parties. The structure of the Portuguese colonial empire in Southeast Asia, less tightly organized than its Spanish counterpart in the New World, rendered the dynamics of conversion, if possible, even more complex. The view of the 17th as the century of compromise and of the accommodatio policy is tied chronologically to the Malabar rights controversy. Recent studies have tended to emphasize conflicts between various Roman congregations and the Society of Jesus, portraying the Ignatian missionaries as proponents of the religious syncretism aimed at taking account of local cultural peculiarities. This sort of perspective has contributed, in my opinion, to obscuring the pervasive violence within the 17th century India mission and a definite tendency to look on converts as inferior. Angela Barreto Xavier has recently suggested that the Indian neophytes in 16th century Goa, notwithstanding their conversion, were condemned to a sort of in-between identity, in a state of inequality with Portuguese citizens. No longer Indians, insofar as they were converts, they were compelled to observe a series of rules which set them outside their communities of origin, but were still by no means treated equally by the Portuguese, given that, as we have said, there were numerous recorded cases where the neophytes were dealt with as inferior, both by lay people and by the clergy. Their status could in some ways be correlated to that of the conversos, and in this light, an analogy between the treatment of the crypto-Jews and the crypto-Hindus is encouraged by Charles Sagnel's research into the inquisitorial proceeding of the Goa Tribunal, of which we have limited knowledge at present, but which seem to suggest further possible avenues of inquiry. In the framework of a spatial segregation, where fortified Portuguese cities in Asia were inhabited by converts separated from the native settlements, the former were at least permitted to live in the Christian neighborhoods or towns ruled by the Portuguese. Francisco Betancourt has underlined, however, that this does not prevent ethnic prejudice from remaining part of normal daily life, and for this reason to speak of an integration of converted natives seems a step too far. So, when we talk of compelling trial in relation to the Portuguese sphere in India, what comes to mind is rather the second half of the 16th century. The story of destruction of Hindu temples and idols on the island of Salsette is well enough known, for example, as are the forced baptisms that took place at around the same time. In a letter of 8 March 1546, João III gave some advice concerning the elimination of pagan idols, but was disturbed by news that had reached him about those who had converted from their Gentile state to our holy faith and been abused and despised by their parents and friends and driven from their homes and stripped of their possessions with violence and insults, so that they were compelled to live in great misery and want and trouble. From a formal point of view, the 1567 Provincial Council of Goa had laid down that it was not permissible to bring anyone to our faith and to baptism by force, with fear and menaces, since no one comes to praise Christ through faith, but that is brought thither by the Heavenly Father through his previous grace and voluntary love. But in reality, The practice of collective baptism remained unchanged in the 17th century, just as the destruction of Hindu temples continued a pace well beyond the first phase of Portuguese colonization. The Francisco Negrão, in a 1610 report from the island of Ceylon, called Trapobana, unshamedly recounts how, since I saw that it was not sufficient to propagate the faith of Christ among the heathen, if one did not extirpate the cult of idols, the lantern bread of our Indian lands, I commenced pulling down and destroying all the idolatrous temples I was able to, wherein I found a multitude of their gods, some of which were sculpted in bronze and gilded, others painted on panels. Out of those of bronze, I ordered that there be made sconces for our altars, lamps, and other utensils for the service of the church of our brothers on this our island. So the missionaries invested heavily in mass ceremonies, and cases of persons baptized more than once were far from rare, given that as catechumens they would receive for some days enough to survive on. In some ways, we are talking of a peculiar kind of violence, where the borderline between missionaries taking advantage of the poverty of the catechumens and the latter exploiting their condition to extract a very temporary advantage for themselves was a fine one. So, when speaking of conversion and violence, then, we cannot avoid analyzing the issue in the light of a range of instances stretching from actual physical violence toward converts to other forms of pressure linked precisely to a hybrid identity, which often led to their being considered a category of person inferior to targets yet to be converted. We can catch a glimpse of such an attitude in two themes which seems to me to intersect in this landscape, that of the lay catechists and that of the native clergy. So now I will speak of these two different cases. In both cases, it is clear that the accommodatio strategy trumpeted by the Jesuits in the Lettre Edifiante Curieuses is in conflict with the actual behavior of the Jesuits, who seem in fact to have been reluctant to treat the indigenous converts on a par with Europeans. Dan Agmon has recently analyzed a revolt in 17,000, involving a group of 3 Tamil catechists who were followers of the well-known French Jesuit Jean-Venant Boucher. They had complained to the local prince, accusing the Jesuits of numerous transgressions and trying to persuade the secular authorities to expel him from the territory. Agmon shows how the catechists, mentioned in passing in the Lettre Edifiant et Curieux, in reality constituted an important conduit between the missionaries and the neophytes, but were subjected to a series of harassment by the former in complete disregard to the importance of their role. And she suggests that this behavior might indicate a fear on the missionaries' part that their personal authority could be supplanted by that of the catechists. More recently, Margherita Trento, that she's working on the communities of neophytes in the Tamil Nadu, has shown that in effect there was a different position from missionaries and these communities. These communities tends to be autonomous from the missionaries. And I will say that the latter, in fact, enjoyed the advantages of being native speakers, the catechists I was speaking, and of already being insiders in the ambience in which the priests were attempting to operate, which rendered them potentially dangerous and the presence of the Jesuits themselves in the long run less essential. So there was a big problem between catechists and missionaries. Violence against converts derived therefore from two different impulses. On the one side, it was an obvious expression of a colonial society in which, as we have said, the converts suffered from their hybrid identity and were thus readily liable to subjugation from various secular and ecclesiastical players. On the other, it seems to be a byproduct of a conflict between missionary groups, in which the converts ended up being the only sufferers. Scapegoats, as it were, yet another indication of their inferior status. In witness of this mechanism, we have, for example, a 16th letter from an anonymous Theatine missionary, later included in a summary of statements produced by the Congregation of Propaganda Fide, according to which the Augustinian and Franciscan were both guilty of violence against converts and furthermore bartered the sacraments. The converts then are maltreated for a variety of motives because they will not go along with the simoniac distribution of the sacrament, and also because they become the subject of bickering between different orders. This sort of accusation is also repeated in other contexts. One Father Francesco Donati, in a private letter to his brother, not therefore intended for Propaganda Fide, accuses the Jesuits of using conversions as a means of political advancement, to the point of excommunicating any converts who frequented the churches of rival orders and not hesitating to manipulate those same Christians who they thrill with trumpets and whistles to petition the king of this country to eject the Dominican fathers from his kingdom. So the administration of the sacraments, or rather the obstacles put in the way of their proper administration by the missionaries, seems to have put the converted free men and genuine slaves in the same boat. In 1640, then, the secular missionary Pietro Borges wrote to the Propaganda Fide cardinals that the neophyte, faithful, and the catechumens are not treated like our neighbors, nor as subjects, but more like slaves, so that they are envious of the Gentiles among whom they live, and those who refuse to convert, so as not to worsen their state. So this condition of slaves, we will find this term slaves in many of these letters, also for converted that are not slaves. So emblematic of this poor treatment was asking money for funeral rites, even from the most indigent, in a barbarous manner, says Borges, and refusing to give the sacraments to untouchables, so the lowest class, lowest caste in the system of caste in India. This last was also a major issue in the Malabar rites controversy. Nobilis' decision to aim to convert principally Brahmins and to present himself not as a European but as a Brahmin sannyasi himself had resulted in the Jesuit not approaching that caste for fear of being contaminated by association and losing the trust of the higher caste converts. From the theological point of view, it was difficult to justify this attitude, which often left untouchable converts without the comfort of the sacrament, and the Jesuits eventually decided to deal with the problem by creating two different types of missionary, so that the high-caste Indians and the so-called pariah could be looked after separately. These transparent rules, however, did little to resolve the problem, if anything, simply emphasizing the Jesuits' different attitude towards the outcasts. But then again, the Portuguese collector of Portugal, Lorenzo Tramallo, wrote from Lisbon, the 8th of June, 1630, that the Brahmins too refused to become Christian, not wanting either to lose their priestly and religious role, nor indeed to find themselves treated worse by European Christians after their baptism than they were when they were Gentiles, since no one would address a Brahmin in lesser terms than your grace, but as Christians they are given the vulgar you, and not offered the chair, not shelter, so that many of those people who seek honor and value it as much of any nation in the world are offended, as a result, and it would therefore behove us to honor them more as Christians than as Gentiles, so as to bring them by this human weakness also to the faith. So it is interesting to note the language employed in this type of conversion narrative, where not only is the close connection between the physical and the spiritual violence visited on the converts apparent, but the second is reckoned more pervasive than the first. Another window on the iniquitous treatment of converts is provided by the large number of Christians that missionaries encountered beyond the confines of the Portuguese provinces. For the most part, these were neophytes fled from Goa for fear of becoming the object of punishment. One conventual Franciscan missionary recorded how the occurrence of apostasy was frequently linked to scandal and discord among the Portuguese friars. A particular effort needed therefore to be made to retain those, I quote, catechumens who for these reasons return to idolatry. So this is a problem that we find many and many times. Many cases of this kind are recorded in the missions of Bicholim and Banda in the part of the Mohammedans and the Gentiles, where there are many others from the Archbishop of Goa who, owing to various crimes and improprieties, now live scattered in diverse parts of this kingdom of Hidalgo. Another motive for flight from Portuguese territories was forced baptism, which, as we have said, was still rife throughout the 17th century, and it is written in a document produced by the Propaganda Fide congregation. Fled into the kingdom of Hidalgo, where thousands of Christians escaped from the Portuguese dominions, and in particular, nearly every one of those 6,000 had been baptized by force on Salsette Island, all of them on the same day, with no prior instruction, and still very inclined to retain their Gentile rights, for which reason, having been interrogated by the Holy Office and deprived of their freedom and entitlements, they were transferred to the mainland and no longer admitted by their own into their Gentile rights, nor knew anything of Christian rules and observances. The status of converts and possessors of a hybrid identity also influenced the debate about the establishment of a native clergy, a debate of extended duration which was even rehearsed in the 1830s by the protagonists of a new cycle of missionary activity. So today we can speak about the 19th century activity, missionary activity, but many of these questions will be reconsidered in the 19th century. If the issue has been hitherto investigated largely at a theoretical level, an analysis conducted in the light of a few specific cases allows us to observe how the clash between bishops active in the Indian dioceses and certain indigenous bishops, such as Mateo de Castro, once again revealed a close intermixing of motivations having to do with ecclesiastical supremacy tied to the power struggle between Padroado and Propaganda Fide, and enduring racist prejudices vis-à-vis the local population. Castro, now we can see here a portrait of Matteo de Castro and a portrait of Francesco Ingoli, who was the secretary of the Propaganda Fide, and and Matteo de Castro was a protege of Francesco Ingoli, and was appointed an apostolic protonotary before returning to Goa. There he was a disputant along with a number of Christian Brahmins in an extended quarrel with the Archbishop of Goa, Francisco dos Mártires, which dragged on from the late 1630s to the end of the 1650s. The affair is known about, but it is worth revisiting the key moments with taking advice from the it's worth revisiting the key moments with the help of the propaganda documentation. Returning to India for the first time in 1633, Castro, after taking advice from the Carmelite visitor and the Dominican vicar, and ignoring the contrary opinion of the Jesuit João da Rocha, an acting archbishop at that time, ordained a number of Brahmins priests, but the ordination was not recognized by the Portuguese clergy. The quarrel provoked a series of offensive letters attacking Castro, and persecution on the spot was extended to the relatives of the ordained. Castro therefore returned to Europe to take up again the cause of indigenous clergy, particularly in the territories not under direct Portuguese control. And he brought to Propaganda Fide these lands. In fact, these lands will soon be lost if not furnished with one or two native prelates, who would be able to maintain enthusiasm from their elevated position, and with new ordination substitute those who die, because long experience has shown that Indian priests and prelates are not regarded with suspicion by the Mohammedan and Gentile kings. Indeed, are welcomed and esteemed, whereas Europeans are looked on as enemies, so that they have never been allowed to set foot on the mainland, though it be no farther from the Christian islands than Trastevere from Rome. Returning once more to India, Castro got permission from the king of Idal Khan in 1637 to found new churches in the royal city of Vijayanagar, on condition that they were manned only by native priests. Clearly, the game was being played entirely on a political basis on both sides. The Portuguese, according to the propaganda party's interpretation, were opposed because motivated by a fierce passion caused by the realization that the creation of indigenous priests would bring to an end any need in those parts for the assistance of foreign clergy and native clergy. And would prevent the encroachment, furthermore, of the spiritual authority of the Crown of Portugal on the kingdom not under its sway. But sorry, because I lost my quotation. From the local rulers' point of view, the European missionaries were seen as nothing other than colonizers, and hence their tolerance was confined to native priests. And also Pietro Borges wrote to Propaganda Fide that the missionaries fear they will lose their privileges if the natives are promoted. So there was a big contrast between these different positions. I believe that the violence perpetrated against converts and the prejudice against the creation of an indigenous clergy can really be seen as two faces of the same coin. Indeed, as Barreto Xavier and Finesse Zupanov have observed in their book Catholic Orientalism, Within the colonial syntax of power relation, the colonized were not allowed to have a higher status and power than the colonizer. It is interesting, though, that Matheus de Castro, in spite of having received lengthy instruction in Europe, should have written a treatise entitled Espejo de Brahmanes, in which, while declaring himself ready to die for the general good of the Church, he pleaded at the same time that the native should be considered as vassals but not as slaves, because his own experience had taught him that Christian Brahmins were treated worse than, I quote, the Turks and the Persians treat their own Christian subjects, end quote. One of the Castro fiercest opponents was the Bishop of Hierapolis, the Italian Carmelite Fra Giuseppe di Santa Maria. Fra Giuseppe di Santa Maria wrote two very important books on the Indies, the first expedition to the Oriental Indies, and a second expedition. Here we can see the cover of the first of this book. And Fra Giuseppe di Santa Maria, he sent also a series of letters to Rome slandering the Castro's work, sent from, and in particular, in 1661, he sent a memorandum to Rome, to the Propaganda Fide, with the title Reasons Why It Is Inopportune to Consecrate as a Bishop Any Native Subject of the Indies. In his memorandum, the Carmelite makes it obvious that his opposition to an indigenous clergy was strongly conditioned by racist prejudice. Early in the Ragioni, in the Reasons, he argues, in fact, that ordination to the priesthood should not be encouraged, I quote, as these are very humble people, in their color, in their dress, in their base parentage, their negligible education, uncivilized manners, limited understanding, and less discernment. So a very... a position very, very strong against native clergy. And as if it were not enough, Giuseppe di Santa Maria continues, because they are of the sort born to serve and not produced to command. But since they will always have to be subjects to the Portuguese, the Castilians, the Dutch, and other Europeans, it is not likely to be acceptable that among such there should appear an Indian prelate of little excellence, unless he were an unusually great saint, and so wise as to be able to overcome by ingenuity the defects of his nature. It was therefore the intrinsically servile nature of those people that justified such an approach, and for all that, Propaganda Fide might appear to be inclined to favor Matheus de Castro in order to demonstrate that the Church of Rome made no distinction between Christians in actual missionary practice things. So, on one side, the Church of Rome made no distinction, but in missionary practice, things went rather differently. Ideological stances, such that of the Fra Giuseppe, encourage a clerical severity toward converts, be they free, slaves, Brahmins, or untouchables. We might add that by the midpoint of the 17th century, the ecclesiastical authorities had begun to fear they were losing control over the proper administration of the Catholic faith in the missionary sphere, and many recantations are recorded by the Goa Tribunal around the middle of the century. And possibly, for this reason, also they fear any encroachment of the indigenous clergy as being more likely to favor syncretistic practices. We can see evidence of the unsettling ambiguity of the category like the indigenous neophytes, always liable to stray off into heterodox practices in another document from the hand of the missionary Pietro Borges. A certain Bramino Bartolomeo Mendes, having converted to Catholicism, decided to sell all that he had and set off from Goa to preach the Christian religion to the poor, without having much in the way of a theological grounding. On his return to the city, he was imprisoned by the Inquisition and, as Pietro Borges said, interrogated as to his doctrine and authority, and having replied that he had been concerned for the well-being of their souls and inspired, as he thought, by God, had preached that the laws of the Gentiles were not good ones, and that the Christian religion was necessary for their welfare. He was given a whipping and exiled. So the Goa tribunal, the Goa Inquisition tribunal, didn't admit that these Brahmins could preach. Could preach as a Christian. Borges condemned the conduct of the Inquisition tribunal, convinced that it was an error on the church's part to repudiate such men as Mendes, but his was a lone voice. All other missionaries tended not to have a different position. So to conclude all this my talk, if on the one side the Propaganda Fide congregation promoted the republication of Francisco Xavier letters, the work of Gian Pietro Maffei, the Malabar Litterae Annue, all this kind of publications, such as the Lettres Édifiants et Curieux, in support of the idea that the Brahmins were not to be considered inferior to the Europeans. On the other, the congregation of the Holy Office, in agreement with the very same Propaganda Fide, from the middle of the 17th century, assumed an increasingly inflexible position vis-à-vis Hindu tradition and usages, culminating in a final condemnation of the Malabar rites under Benedict XIV in 1744. In this notably ambiguous context, the hybrid identity of the converts, and in particular of the indigenous clergy or the lay catechists, assumed almost by definition the appearance of the threat to Roman Orthodoxy. And control had in practice to be exercised with some degree of violence, and such a strategy could not but impinge over the long term on relations with the Oriental missionary world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. La ringrazio per il suo intervento. Passamos agora à parte de diálogo, com as questões, com as observações, como habitualmente. Poderemos tomar a palavra e fazer essas intervenções diretamente em inglês ou em italiano, se for o caso. Também é possível fazer as perguntas em português, eventualmente por escrito, mas também oralmente, e o Dr. Francisco Renzi terá todo o gosto em fazer a tradução para que a professora Sabina Pavone possa responder. Terminamos aqui a nossa sessão do seminário. Teremos uma próxima sessão no dia 21 de junho. Este mês temos 2 sessões, como estava já agendado previamente. O tema, o padre António Fernandes, sua percepção do celibato e a vida ascética dos etíopes. Estará connosco para abordar este tema Leonardo Cohen, da Ben Gurion University. A comunicação do dia 21 de junho será em espanhol. Terminamos aqui a nossa sessão. Obrigado a todos pela partecipação. La ringrazio un'altra volta per essere con noi questa sera.
Obrigada. Speriamo di vederci a Porto.